All right, so I'm Nick Cizzoni, and I'll be presenting my Legacy of the Progressive Era presentation. So for the introduction, 5 major themes of coverage will be the regulation of business, greater democracy, conservationism, rise of professionalism, and prohibition. So the rise and the fall of the progressive era in the United States was a time in which large-scale economic, political, and social changes occurred. This PowerPoint will be outlining the 5 major themes within the document space, which include regulation of business, greater democracy, conservationism, the rise of professionalism, and prohibition. Okay, first slide, regulation of business. When looking at the regulations among business in this time, the thought immediately shifts to large businesses such as railroads, oil, and steel. Factory work was common, and large monopolies had been in formation for the later half of the 19th century. Established in the era was the Sherman Antitrust Act passed in 1890, the federal government's first attempt to break up monopolies, which was later enforced by Theodore Roosevelt, who also developed the use of the Hepburn Act of 1906, which limited prices that railroads could charge and allowed the federal government to monitor the financial books of the large railroad companies. Also similarly created by Roosevelt was the square deal, in which businesses would be run by expert management rather than the popular candidate. So basically allow for it to have a better management system, which would entail it to be obviously more productive, but also being better managed. It would allow for companies to have better labor laws and be able to flow better as a company because employees are happier. Created in 1914 was the Clayton Antitrust Act, which put limits on mergers, acquisitions, and prevented business owners from owning 2 or more companies in competing fields. So what companies would do is they would have more than one company in competing fields. And because of that, it just would create a larger monopoly in itself, because the 2 or more businesses would be able to entice all of the other ones, basically annexing them or isolating them from the competition, as the 2 large businesses would almost be in somewhat of a merger without actually merging. 1914 also hosted the introduction of the Federal Trade Commission, a government agency that had the right to investigate business practices and issue rulings to prevent businesses from continuing such practices. The muckrakers, who were investigative writers, helped the nation understand what was really going on inside these corporations, such as poor working conditions, company manipulation, and corruption in big businesses. The Pure Food and Drug Act, along with the Meat Inspection Act, gave the federal government responsibility ensuring that meat would reach its customers fresh and disease-free. All of these worked hand in hand with one another in an attempt to break down big business and clean up the economy of the United States, along with protecting the lives of the citizens, whether that be what they were eating or how the food got to their tables. Next slide. Greater democracy. The Galveston hurricane of the 1900 helped generate voices advocating for the middle class. This being in direct correlation with how the individuals saw this as a lack of government meeting the needs of the people. In the result of this case came the introduction of the initiative and referendum terms. With these terms came to allow citizens more control over state law. This being that an initiative is a citizen's proposal for a new piece of legislation that can appear on a ballot and be voted by his or her fellow citizens, and a referendum being a citizen-led effort to strike down a law passed by a legislator. So if they thought a law was somewhat corrupt or didn't necessarily benefit them or benefit their needs or benefit the people around them, then they could use a referendum in coordinates with others in order to strike down that legislation. This allowed individuals to not only feel more heard by the governing body above them, but allowed the citizens to make a real difference in the societal structure that they happen to reside in. Similarly worked the primary elections and the recall, which acted as the primary is a preliminary election designed to let voters choose which political candidates will run for public office. giving them more choice within the governmental system, rather than leaving the selection to potentially corrupt politicians, whereas before, corrupt politicians had more control over different sanctions than your everyday citizen, which is, if you think about it, calling our nation a democratic republic, obviously there's democracy that's worked in with it. A complete democracy would mean that we wouldn't even get representation. But obviously we're not that. We have representatives who we vote for, and this is thanks to that act, and thanks to those laws that are created. And the recall, by which petitioning citizens with a vote dismiss state officers, governors, and judges deemed to have violated popular interest, so it works in a similar manner. With these newly introduced devices of democracy, it allowed individuals more freedom and choice when it came to what kind of government that they needed or perhaps wanted in office. A man by the name of Charles Beard looked at women's suffrage as the inevitable product of a growing democracy, rather than as an economic conquest. This being that regardless of the crucial role that women played in the economy system, such as, working in factories, working at home for some, it was bigger than that. Women deserve more than to be looked at as just wanting more rights in order to make more money. The scheme was bigger than that and bigger than economics, and finally came to be as women obtained the right to vote after the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920.